thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Michelle from Iconic Offices. So if you're new to Iconic, we provide flexible workspaces here in Dublin. And as part of our Iconic virtual events, we're here with coaching psychologist Jayson Moran today, and he's here to talk to us about how to be happier in 2020. So I'll pass it over to Jayson now, and thank you.
Hi guys, so how are you? So first off, I just want to say thank you very much for everyone for coming down. Really nice to see this many people turn out. I know there's a million webinars on at the minute, so appreciate you coming to check out my one. I appreciate it's free, but I suppose you are paying with your time and your attention, and there's probably not a whole lot more valuable out there. So I suppose just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. I'm going to try and use the chat box extensively during this. So maybe just to test it out, just to see if everyone is able to use it and knows how to use it. Can I just ask, how is everybody doing today? How's their day going? Maybe just let me know in the chat box just to make sure that's all working, if that's okay. Thanks, Andrea. Good. Thanks, Emil. Cheers. Thanks, Amy. Good too. Happy Friday. Thank you, Claire. All good. Cheers, Aoife. Thank you, Sonia. Very good, Claire. Thanks so much. Okay, so if you guys have any questions during the talk, please put them into the chat box. So I've got a separate screen set up, so I'm going to try and keep an eye on that. So if you have any questions during the talk, please let me know. I will try to do a little bit of Q&A at the end if we have time as well. And finally, if you have a pen and a piece of paper handy, that will come in very useful during this, because it will be quite interactive. I'm going to try and put you to work during this as well, if that's okay. So if you can grab a pen and a piece of paper, that'd be great. Okay, so I suppose to those of you who don't know me, I'll just introduce myself, if that's okay. So my name is Jayson Moran, and I am a coaching psychologist. So what that means is I help people increase their impact by increasing their effectiveness. And I do this by looking at kind of three key areas. So firstly, I help people to better understand themselves a bit better. So we're looking at the question of kind of who you are, where you're at in the world right now. So we might look at things like your personality. We might look at the balance in your life or the performance in various areas of your career or your business. The second question I tend to help people with is to help them to better understand what it is that they want. So we might look at things like their goals, I suppose, and what it is that they want to achieve. So we're asking the question, where do you want to go? And so we might look at their goals in terms of how they're structured. Are they structured in such a way that means that they're more likely to achieve them? Are they completely clear on what it is that they want? And is what, are their goals in line with what's important and with the person that they are as well? Third area where I tend to help people is in helping them understand or get a better understanding of what's getting in the way to them achieving those goals. So those barriers can be both psychological and practical in nature. Some examples of practical barriers might be things like getting organized, having a system for your inputs and outputs, decision making, having a model for that, or problem solving. More psychological topics that I tend to deal with, or barriers, are things like stress, confidence, procrastination, and motivation. So today I am going to talk a little bit about happiness. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes us happy, some of the 6 kind of key elements of happiness according to positive psychology, which is what my master's is in. And I'm also going to talk about some tips, tools, and techniques in each of these elements that you can use to try and make yourself a little bit happier. So I suppose a question to address is, I suppose my main focus is I'm a performance and achievement coach to an extent. And I suppose, what is my interest in happiness? Well, initially, I suppose the thing with happiness is people who are happier tend to perform better and achieve more. So for example, happier people tend to earn higher incomes. Happier people tend to have better work performance. Happier people tend to take less risks as well, which means they make less mistakes. Happier people also tend to have better physical and mental health, which in turn is very much linked to better performance and achievement. And happier people also tend to have better relationships, which is very important for things like teamwork and interpersonal relations and working with other people. So in terms of what makes you happy, well, I suppose it's important to address some of the things that I suppose we think will make us happy. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is money. Does money make us happy? I suppose the answer to that is yes and no. So if you are, I suppose, in need, if you're living in poverty, or if you're not living in a developed nation, then getting extra money will tend to make you happier. I suppose a lot of that is because it means if you're in one of these two situations, then it means your basic needs aren't being met. And so what money allows in that instance is it lets you meet your basic needs, which will in turn increase your happiness. But I suppose overall, in more Western developed nations, and for the vast majority of us, it looks like more money doesn't actually make us happier. So they've been measuring subjective well-being, which is like a kind of the gold standard in a measurement of happiness for about the last 50 years. And that hasn't really went up, but wealth in kind of most Western countries has. So that kind of indicates to us that even though people are an awful lot richer, so for example, the average house size in America has doubled in the last 50 years, or it used to take 3 weeks' salary to buy the average TV, now it takes 3 days' salary. So even though we've got a lot richer, we're not reporting ourselves as being a whole lot happier. So if our needs aren't being met, money will make us happier, but otherwise it doesn't really seem to. So what about a change in our circumstances? So for example, what might happen if you won the lottery? Well, you guys might have heard about a very famous study done in the late 70s, early 80s that studied lottery winners and found that after a period of time that they weren't any happier really. Well, it turns out that study was a bit flawed. It was actually quite small. So more recently, they've done a study of 200 Swedish lottery winners. And it turns out that, funnily enough, that winning the lottery does actually make you significantly happier and for a prolonged period of time. But what about, I suppose, winning the lotto is quite a rare thing to happen to us. So what about more common circumstances that happen to us in life? So for example, what about if a loved one dies? Or if we get married, you would imagine that might make you happier. Or if we get divorced, you might imagine that might make us less happy. Well, it turns out that no, that after a period of time, we tend to revert back to our old level of happiness on average. And there is individual differences here. Certain people will find these things will make them happier, and certain people will find that they make them sadder, but on average, we don't. And the reason for this is because of a phenomenon called the hedonic treadmill or hedonic adaptation. What this means simply is that we tend to adapt, or we tend to get used to our circumstances. So for example, if you get a raise in work, and initially that might make you feel happier because you've got more money, and so relative to where you were, you're in a better place. But after a period of time, we get used to it. So we just get used to having more money, and we get used to that quality of life. And so our level of happiness tends to drop back down. So what does make us happy? Well, it turns out there's kind of three major factors. The first is we have a genetic set point. So there's certain personality traits that are kind of determined by biology that decide whether we're happy or not. So how they know this is they done lots of studies with twins. So they compared identical twins, which have got the exact same DNA, and fraternal twins, which would have the exact same circumstances, but not the exact same DNA. And what they found is that identical twins tend to be much happier. Or sorry, identical twins tend to have the same level of happiness, much more so than fraternal twins. So in the case that there's a genetic set point, and they've calculated that this accounts for about 50% of your happiness. And this makes sense. I mean, we all know people who you can put them in the most terrible situation in the world and they're still happy and bubbly. And we all know people who you can put them in the most amazing situation and they'll still find something to moan about. So personality kind of, I suppose, makes up for a lot of our happiness. About 10% of our happiness is down to our life circumstances. And kind of, as I was explaining, this is down to the hedonic treadmill, and that doesn't have that big of an effect. So this leaves about 40%. And it's suggested that with this 40% that we can affect our happiness with what are called intentional activities. So i.e. we can do things to make ourselves happier. Okay. So I suppose, what are these things? Well, I suppose I could ask the question to the group, what makes you happy? But I suppose it's a big question, might be a bit difficult to answer. So what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to answer the next question in the chat box instead. So specifically, what were you doing the last time you were happy? Maybe just let me know in the chat box what your answer to this is. So for me, the last time I remember being, I suppose, noticeably happy is I was driving home from my parents' house with my girlfriend having the chats. Chatting with a friend this morning, having coffee this morning. Coffee makes me happy too. Movie and a pizza with the kids, nice. So what's nice about that is they're noticing a lot of social connection. There's also kind of immediate pleasure, eating breakfast, catching up with my friend this morning, again, social. Swimming in the sea with my mates this morning. I love swimming in the sea. It is awesome. Having dinner with friends, walking on the beach with your best friend, talking to a work colleague who's a friend, helped an injured animal get better. Okay, that's very interesting. I will talk a little bit about that. So that to me has got to do with you found a meaning or a purpose. You found something important. Being on the beach with kids and friends. So a lot of it seems to be with nature as well, which is interesting. But a lot of it is social, you know. I think I would say 80 to 90% of things or what people are reporting is talking about doing things with other people, which is interesting. Okay, my boojum on Monday. I also love a boojum, Michelle. Helping my customer grow their online business. Again, very much linked to the idea of purpose. Okay. So I suppose the point of that exercise is that often we think things like money or circumstances are really what makes us happy, when in fact there might be a little bit more going on. There might be other kind of elements to happiness that we haven't quite put our finger on. Okay. And so this is the topic of a branch of psychology called positive psychology. You know, the question of, you know, what are the elements to happiness? What makes us happy? I suppose they don't really talk so much about happiness as well-being. Well-being is a bit of a broader term. So I suppose when we think of happiness, we often think of what's called positive emotion. And it turns out that positive emotion is only one kind of element of happiness or one element of well-being. Yeah? And so the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about so there's another 5 elements to well-being, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each element and how we can kind of raise our level of happiness using that. So the first element is positive emotion. The next element is, are you engaging with your strengths? Are you using what you're good at? The next element of happiness is is the depth and strength of the positive relationships in your life. And I think this came up a lot in the chat box just there. A lot of people, the last time they were happy was when they were with other people that obviously seemed to mean something to them. The next element of happiness is, have we got a sense of meaning or a sense of purpose? And the fifth is our sense of achievement. You know, are we moving towards our goals? The sixth element of happiness is got to do with health and vitality. And I think this is important because I suppose unless you have health and vitality, working in a lot of the other areas isn't probably going to make you a whole lot happy, because if you don't have your health, you don't have a whole lot. Now, I'm not going to talk a huge amount about health and vitality today, because I think there's a lot of people in the medical profession who can give you much better advice on that. I'm going to focus on the first 5. So the first one I want to talk a little bit about is positive emotion. I suppose this is often what people associate with happiness. And I suppose if you were to define positive emotion, often we think of it as, I suppose, a singular thing, you know, feeling good to an extent. It turns out there is not just one positive emotion, but there is many of them. So this is the top 10, not in any particular order, but these are the top 10 most experienced positive emotions. So we've got joy, amusement, forgiveness, gratitude, hope, appreciation, serenity, interest, awe, and finally love. And I suppose apart from feeling good when we experience these positive emotions, what they do allow us to do is, I suppose, they've got a positive effect on the rest of our lives as well. Because what positive emotions allow us to do, and this is according to a theory called the broaden and build theory of positive emotion, is to help us to build resources and create, I suppose, help us build positive aspects of our lives. And they do this by changing how we think and changing how we act. So I'll give you some examples, for example. So if we feel the positive emotion of hope, and we generally feel hope when we're in a bad situation and we want things to be better, we tend to get creative and inventive, and we tend to problem solve. And this kind of builds optimism and durability and resilience. When we feel the emotion of contentment, we tend to feel contentment when things are right. We tend to savor, you know, when something goes really nice, I imagine having a really nice cup of coffee or whatever, we tend to savor it. And what this causes us to do is develop new priorities, kind of going, well, you know what, this feels good, I should be doing this more often. The positive emotion of interest helps us create, or we feel interest when we come across new things or novel things. And this triggers the thought of we want to explore, and this helps us build skill and knowledge. The final positive emotion I want to talk about is love. So we tend to experience love when we feel one of the other positive emotions in the presence of a safe interpersonal connection or relationship. And what love lets us do is it helps us build social connection, and it helps us build social bonds and community. So I suppose the point is, positive emotions, it's not just about feeling good, they actually help us lead better lives and help with the other aspects of our well-being as well. So how do we go about generating positive emotion? Well, I suppose that's kind of what a lot of the rest of the talk is about, but there's also specific exercises you can do. And this is one of them. This is called 3 good things. So I'm going to get you guys to do this now. So what I want you to do, I want you to take out your pen and a piece of paper. And I want you to And I want you to write down 3 good things that have happened yesterday and why they happened. And while you're doing that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the exercise, if that's okay. So this is an exercise that I would normally get people to do at the end of a day. And I get them to do it at the end of the day and write about, I suppose, what's happened over the course of that day. And the reason I get people to do that is often at the end of a day, you can be focused on the things that went wrong in that day, or you can be focused on what you have to do in the next day. And so I suppose we have a tendency to focus on the negative. So what this exercise does is it gets us to tend to focus on the positive. And this is important because I suppose focusing on the positive helps us, I suppose, appreciate. So we tend to be a bit more, we tend to feel more gratitude as a result as well. Just hang on 1 second, guys. Sorry, I'm just having a power issue with my computer. So just bear with me 1 moment. Super sorry. Sorry, just 1 second. Super sorry, guys. And so what generally tends to happen with this is that if you try and do this, is often you can kind of struggle to do it. So it turns out the next day, what you end up doing is you start trying to look for good things that you can write down the next evening. So normally I get people to do this for 7 days every evening. Can I ask in the chat box, did you guys manage to be able to write down 3 good things that happened yesterday and why they happened? Maybe just let me know in the chat box if you got it. Yeah, okay, awesome. So the reason we write down why they happened is that it helps us deepen our thinking around it as well. And so it's kind of strengthening the neural connections. Okay. Highly recommend to try this for a week. Can be really good for helping you to see, I suppose, some of the good aspects of your life. Okay. So the next element of happiness I'm going to talk about is about engaging with your strengths and the concept of flow. Now, I don't know, you guys might have heard of the concept of flow before, but I'll talk a little bit about it now. So what engaging with your strengths about is it's about using what you're good at. So your strengths are actually a specific thing. It's your positive personality attributes. So these are kind of consistent patterns of how you think, of how you behave, of how you feel. So for example, you know, your creativity, your curiosity, your judgment. So if you want to find out what your strengths are, you can go to that link at the bottom there, www.viacharacter.org, and you can do a free assessment, which will help you kind of identify your strengths. And so I suppose, why does engaging with your strengths or using your strengths, why does that help with your well-being? Well, it turns out it feels pretty good. So my top strength is, when I've done that VIA-Character.org assessment, is industry, diligence, and perseverance. So I tend to work hard to finish what I start, no matter what the project is. I get it out the door. I don't get distracted when I work, and I take satisfaction in completing tasks. So when we tend to engage our strengths, we tend to experience certain feelings. So for example, we often get a sense that this is the real me. We often feel excited when we use our top strengths. We often have a rapid learning curve when we first start using it. We tend to excel. We tend to be very good at using these particular strengths. Importantly, we often tend to feel energized when we use our strengths. And this is important because often when we work on our weaknesses, it can be tiring and it can be tough and it can be hard. So it can be kind of demotivating. So sometimes focusing on what you're good at, focusing on your strengths rather than focusing on your weaknesses, can be very important in terms of your productivity. We also tend to create and pursue personal projects around our strengths. I suppose I have to say all of these are true of me in terms of, you know, I do get a sense this is the real me when I'm working on a project and it's going well. My whole business, to be honest, is kind of created around the idea of helping people be industrious, being diligent, and persevere in terms of their performance. So all in all, engaging with your strengths feels good. So peak state of engaging with your strengths is what's called flow. And flow is like a peak experience. It was first talked about by a Croatian psychologist, a guy called Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He studied top athletes, top musicians, top performers, top scientists to talk about, or to kind of study this kind of key state. So we tend to experience flow when we engage our greatest strengths to meet our greatest challenges that come our way. So flow is like a sensation of being fully absorbed to the point of heightened consciousness. So it's when we're really sucked into something, when we're really absorbed. So often people describe it as being in the zone. they'll describe time as passing really, really quickly. So I notice, like, when I do coaching or when I public speak, it seems to go really, really quickly. It's like, it's almost like I click my fingers and, you know, an hour has passed, or 90 minutes or whatever I'm coaching or talking for. We also experience it as we don't worry about anything else, because we've lost consciousness. We're not thinking, we're not feeling, we're just doing. So it's really, really about being in the zone. So it often happens with athletes and musicians as well. You see them playing at the height of it. They're just really lost in the music, or they're lost in the problem. Or if you're a musician sometimes as well, you kind of really click and connect with the audience. So how do we get more of this flow state? Well, a lot of times people get it from work, and I have to say I get it from my own work at the minute, but I didn't always. So I used to use hobbies to get into flow. So I used to paint, but I think other good hobbies to get into flow can be things like a martial art or music, anything really that you would class as serious play, anything you can kind of get better at. And the reason for this is, one of the characteristics of flow tasks is that there's a match between your level of skill and the level of difficulty of the task, or how challenging the task is. And hobbies kind of let you change that. So we tend to get into flow when the level of difficulty, if you look in the top left-hand corner of the box there, is high, and our skill level is high. So it's when we're doing something that's challenging, but we're able to meet that challenge, you know? Conversely, we tend to be relaxed when our skill level is high, when we're really good at something, but the difficulty level isn't very high. And this is, being relaxed is a nice state, but it's not that fully absorbed kind of state of flow that we're aiming for. So how do we get from relaxation up to flow? Well, what we can do is we can kind of make the difficulty level a little bit harder. So with a lot of hobbies, so say with painting, maybe you might try and paint something that's more realistic or more difficult to paint. With a martial art, maybe you might move up a belt and make it more difficult that way, so you're fighting more difficult opponents. And with music, maybe you try and play a harder tune or a harder song. A second aspect of this is sometimes when a task is particularly difficult and our skill level isn't particularly high, we can feel a little bit stressed or alert or a little bit anxious. And so what do we do then? Well, I suppose if we're finding that what we're finding is a little bit difficult, what we can do is practice. And this is another aspect of what a hobby allows. So we can kind of always start to move towards flow by doing a hobby, because, you know, if we're finding that we're too relaxed, we can make it more difficult. But if we're finding if we're a little bit anxious and a little bit stressful, then we have to practice and get a little bit better. So, you know, we practice our musical instrument, or we practice our martial art, or we practice painting. Another aspect, another characteristic of flow tasks is that they tend to be intrinsically motivating. So they tend to be things we want to do as opposed to things we have to do. So I suppose, you know, if you're not a gym bunny, going to the gym is probably not a good place to find flow. But for someone who's really into their gym, then you can totally find flow in the gym. And so hobbies are good for this because we generally choose them. Also, flow tasks tend to have clear goals and a sense of progress. So this is why a hobby can be important as well, because with most hobbies, we can always kind of get better at it or improve. And most of the positive feeling we feel when we get into flow is because of this sense of progress. So we tend to feel positive emotion when we're moving towards a goal, yeah? And finally, in terms of a flow task, it must have clear and immediate feedback. And this is important in terms of that sense of progress, because we need to know that we're getting better. We need to know how we're performing in order to slip into that flow state. So that's flow and why you should get a hobby in terms of trying to experience more of it. Just to check with you guys, I'm making sense. Do I need to go a little bit faster or slower? Is everything okay? Maybe just let me know in the chat box, pace-wise, if everything is okay, if I'm explaining myself. All good? Awesome, cool. Thanks so much. Okay, so the next aspect of happiness I'm going to talk about is our level of positive relationships. So I suppose positive relationships are important in terms of our well-being. Well, first off, they're very important for our health. So this turns out a study by a guy called George Valance from Harvard, and he studied people over 60 years. What he found was the greatest predictor of your longevity, or of how long you would live, was actually the strength and the depth of the positive relationships in your life. So it actually affects how long we live. In terms of our well-being, in terms of our happiness, it's also very important. A recent study also from Harvard showed that 40% of people who were married, so obviously in a very close relationship, described themselves as very happy. This is compared to only 23% of unmarried people describing themselves as very happy. So if I was to ask you guys, just in terms of positive relationships, I suppose it's an interesting question to think, how would you define a positive relationship? Like what does a positive relationship have to have for it to be positive? Or what's a relationship got to have for it to be positive? Maybe let me know in the chat box what you think. Support, yeah. A two-way system, yeah, very good. So I'd say that's empathy. Respect and understanding. Respect seems to be very important. Communication. Fun, happy and positive, effortlessly. Okay, great. Mutuality, fun and trust, very interesting. Laughter is very important. Okay, well, I suppose a definition of a positive relationship I really like is by a guy called Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers defined a positive relationship as a relationship that helps you grow, which I really like. Rogers also talks about other very important aspects of positive relationships. So things like non-judgment, not judging other people, empathy, trying to understand other people, which kind of come up in the chat box quite a bit, and concern. So we need to care about the other person. We need to care what happens. There's also skills that we can develop in terms of positive relationships. So things like listening, acceptance, understanding, and sharing. And these are all things that you can learn, which is the nice thing about it. So in terms of one tool I wanted to give you guys for today, I suppose in terms of helping your relationships, is a tool that I use with people a lot, especially when they're in conflict with other people, is called reframe the blame. So what reframe the blame is about, it's rather than when you're in conflict with someone, maybe somebody's annoying you, let's say pissing you off a little bit, rather than avoid the conflict or be passive or I suppose lash out or get too aggressive, what we're going to do is going to be try to be a little bit more assertive. And so a big part of being assertive is, a lot of it is about asking for what you want or what you need. So often when we get into conflict with people, so say for example, your partner isn't doing their fair share of the cleaning around the house. Often what we tend to do is we tend to criticize. Now we can do this internally or externally. Sometimes we'll say it, sometimes we won't. But we tend to criticize other people. So say they're not doing their half of the cleaning, you might go, you know, you're selfish or you're lazy. So rather than doing that, what I suggest we do is, rather than criticize the person, what you want to do is you want to criticize the behavior. So you might do something like, you know, tell the other person how their behavior is making you feel. So for example, it might sound something like this, you know, when you don't do the dishes, it makes me feel frustrated. Or when you don't do your half of the cleaning, it makes me feel sad. The nice thing about this is, one, you're criticizing the behavior, not the person, but two, it's very difficult to argue with expressing your feelings. The next thing you need to do is tell them what you would like instead. So, you know, it might sound something like, you know, in future, I would like you to do the cleaning Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I'll do it Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Or, you know, I'll cook on Mondays, you cook on Tuesdays, whatever. The next step is, do you want to state the positive outcomes of compliance? So, you know, what you really want to say is, you know, this would mean is, maybe in our example, this would mean I'm not so pissed off, or I'm not so stressed going around the house all the time, and this would be better for you as well. And the final point about this is, you got to remember, in terms of reframing the blame, it's always a negotiation. So all the way through the conversation, you want to be asking them what they think. Is this okay with them? Because I suppose all the best relationships are about give and take and negotiation, as you guys had said in the chat box. Okay. So the next aspect of happiness I want to talk about is meaning, or having a sense of purpose. So often we find meaning from doing something outside of ourselves. And I suppose people often talk about service. But I suppose a psychologist I really liked, he talks about meaning, is a guy called Michael Steger. And Steger says that meaning, or finding meaning in our lives, is all about having comprehension and purpose. So comprehension is about understanding ourselves and our place in the world, who we are and where we're at. And then from that understanding of ourselves and that place in the world, then we can use that to set goals. Yeah. So how do we go about finding meaning? Well, these are three methods I use with clients that you might find useful. So first, often what we'll do is we'll define what's important and see if we can set goals and act in line with what's important. So for example, so you might do that by looking at your personality, because that will give you a good indication of, you know, what you like and what you dislike, what motivates you. But also you can look at your values, and your values are just kind of an abstract idea of what's important. So I'll give you an example. One of my kind of keystone values is that I like autonomy, and that's a big part of the reason I work for myself. So I find meaning in working for myself because I like to be independent. So a couple of really good books on this. There's an oldie but a goodie called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. There's lots of good exercise in terms of defining your values and turning those values into goals in that book. And a more recent one, very entertaining, especially the audiobook, is The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck, let's call it, by a gentleman called Mark Manson. And that again is about kind of figuring out what's important and also what's not important and acting in line with what's important. A second way we can find meaning in our lives is by facing our challenges. So some of the most meaningful experiences I've had in my life have been when I've overcome, I suppose, what at the time seemed like kind of unsurmountable problems. In my 20s, I suffered really badly with anxiety and a lack of assertiveness. More recently, I kind of quit smoking a couple of years ago. That was very meaningful. And also overcoming, I had a huge fear of public speaking for a long time. So overcoming these challenges, you can really find meaning in them, because often we define ourselves by how we overcome our problems. And this is an interesting bit, because if you start to kind of focus on this, you can start to see your problems more as challenges and opportunities in order to find meaning in your life, rather than seeing them as a bad thing. The final way that I like to help clients find meaning is we can find meaning in the choices that we make. And so these choices can be like big macro choices, what are you going to do with your life? But you can also find meaning in the micro choices you make in your life, those little day-to-day decisions that you make. So for example, maybe you're in conflict with someone and maybe you make the decision to make the first move in terms of like, I suppose, repairing the relationship. Or maybe it's making a decision about spending time with an elderly neighbor for a few minutes because they've been in lockdown because of COVID and they're quite isolated. Or maybe it's just doing a little small nice thing for your partner out of the blue. So you can really find meaning in those little micro choices. And what I like about this is sometimes people think of finding meaning in their life and they have to have a big purpose and a career or whatever. Sometimes they can find meaning by just doing the right thing at the right time. Okay, the final aspect of happiness I want to talk a little bit about is achievements. So it turns out one of the main sources of positive emotion that we feel in the world is a sense of achievement. Are we progressing towards our goals? I suppose rather than talk about that, what I'm going to do a little exercise with you guys for the last couple of minutes, just to kind of demonstrate that. So I want you guys to take out your pen and piece of paper again, and I want you to answer a couple of questions for me. So the first question the first thing I want you to do is I want you to pick one area of your life you would like to improve. So here's some options, just in case you need. So maybe you want to improve your career or your business. Maybe you want to improve your relationship with your friends or your family or your significant other. Maybe you want to improve the creative side of your life or your hobbies. Or maybe you want to improve your physical environment. So maybe you want to do something with your house or your apartment, or maybe with your larger community. Maybe you want to improve your mental health, or maybe you want to improve your physical health, or maybe you want to improve your financial situation. And finally, maybe you want to improve the level of fun and recreation in your life. Now, I suppose that's kind of exhaustive, but maybe I've missed something in terms of an area of your life. So you can choose something else. But firstly, I want you to pick one area. So once you've picked that area, I want you to rate how satisfied you are in it from a scale of 1 to 10. So 1 being you're not satisfied at all, and 10 being you're completely and utterly satisfied. Now, hopefully, if it's an area you want to improve, you're probably going to give it a score less than 7, but I want you to rate it out of 10. And once you've rated it out of 10, I want you to write down why did you give it that score. Just a sentence or two, doesn't have to be an essay. I just kind of want you to reflect on why you're, I suppose, a little bit unsatisfied in that area. So I'm going to pick the area, just to do an example, I'm going to pick the area of my creativity and hobbies. And I'm going to give that a score of 5 out of 10. And the reason I'm going to give that a score of 5 out of 10 is that I suppose I do get to do a lot of creative stuff in my job, but in my personal life, I suppose I've kind of let a lot of my hobbies and stuff fall to the wayside because I've been quite busy with work. Okay, so just let me know in the chat box if you guys have managed to do all this. So have you managed to pick an area, rate it out of 10, and maybe write down a sentence about why you gave it that score? Yeah? Okay. Maybe I'll give you guys another minute. Okay, awesome. Cool. Okay, thanks very much. So what I would like you to ask yourselves now is, what would it take to move that score up by just 1? What would it take to move the dial up by 1? So you don't have to answer this in the chat box, but just take a second and have a think of, so maybe if you're at, so I'm at a 5. So what I would like to do to move the dial up by 1 is I'd like to get back into music. And I would like to start, I suppose, making myself a little time to get back into learning about music I used to do a bit of DJing years ago, and I really always wanted to get into learning how to make music. Okay, so the next question I want you guys to ask is, what action can you take in the next 24 to 72 hours? I'm kind of saying that because it's coming up to the weekend. What action can you take in the next 24 to 72 hours to help you get to move that dial up by 1? So what I'm going to do is I've downloaded a book on music theory weeks ago, and I'm actually going to put aside an hour later this evening to start reading that book on music theory to help me kind of move my dial up by 1. Okay, final question, and you can answer this in the chat box. So if you take that action, if you move towards that goal a little bit, how do you think that will make you feel? Maybe let me know in the chat box. By taking that one action, how might you feel? Accomplished, yeah? Motivated, yeah? So I suppose, sound hopeful, hopeful, very good, that I can get the control to make the change, a little bit motivated. So I suppose the idea with this is, you know, sometimes just making that little small step, that little small win can really help with your feeling of well-being and how happy you are. You know, it doesn't need to be big things. We don't need to be changing the world. Sometimes just moving slightly towards an area that's important to us in our life. So what I like about this and the whole model in general is, I think in one way it gives us a nice formula for happiness. So the way I like to think of the model is this: is the main source of positive emotion in our lives is when we move towards a goal, we've got a sense of progress towards something that has meaning, towards something that is important to us. Preferably doing that in the presence of people who love us and who we love, while we're engaging with our strengths, while we're using what we're good at. So the main source of positive emotion we have in our lives is moving towards a goal that we feel is important in the presence of those we love, while using what we're good at. Okay. So just to sum up, I suppose at the beginning, I talked a little bit about how happiness and well-being was a very important aspect of performance and achievement, that we tend to perform better when we are happier. You know, we tend to, happier people tend to earn more money, perform better, have better relationships, etc. Then I talked a little bit about the 5 elements of happiness according to the PERMA model. So positive emotion, and we gave you that 3 good things exercise that can help you improve your optimism and gratitude. We talked about engaging with your strengths and how hobby can really help you kind of find that flow state if you're not getting it in work. We talked about positive relationships and how important they were, and how you can use that tool of reframe the blame. So rather than criticizing other people, you can ask for what you want. I also talked about meaning and how we can find meaning by kind of defining what's important and acting in line with that, by kind of dealing with those difficult or hard things in our lives, and by the small individual choices we make. And finally, I talked about achievement and how we can get a sense of achievement and therefore feel happier by creating these little small wins for ourselves and moving towards goals. So I suppose, to wrap it up, I suppose the idea, I started with happiness is an important aspect of performance, but it also turns out performance and achievement is also a very important aspect of happiness and of being happy. I suppose that explains a lot about, I suppose I explained at the beginning of the talk what I do. And this is a lot of the reason why I do what I do, because when we tend to perform better and we tend to be moving towards our goals, we tend to be happier. I suppose that's my ultimate goal. Okay. Thank you very much. That's me. I'm afraid to look, oh no, we're pretty much on time. Sorry for a minute or two. I suppose we're a minute or two starting. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to hand you back to Michelle now, and she will talk us out.